This video, A Guide to Beekeeping in the Tropics, is an initiative funded by the New Zealand-Fiji Business Council in association with New Zealand Aid. In this video, Gavin McKenzie of McKenzie Beelines in Fiji will be taking you through the many important aspects of tropical beekeeping. While the video directly concerns beekeeping in Fiji, the information in this video is applicable to all tropical beekeepers throughout the wider Asia Pacific.
A honeybee is a wild insect that is adapted to living on honey and pollen, and it's learnt to store those products, to process those products, to store them, to exist over times when there's no food around. It lives purely on nectar, which some flowers produce as a reward and attractant to bees, and it lives on pollen as its main protein food, which again plants produce in abundance, but for their own pollination. The bees' adaptation to living on what flowers produce was a harmonious relationship between an insect and the plant. The plants need the bees for pollination. To get that pollination, they reward the bees with nectar to attract the bees to come in, and in the process of them getting nectar from the flower, they also cross-pollinate the flowers. Around the top of the frame you can see nectar, honey. You can see pollen, which is stored there for the bees' food. The pollen is mixed with nectar, and it appears to go through some sort of fermentation process, which breaks it down into a product that the bees can consume readily, and it's known to beekeepers as bee bread. It's similar to what we do with grinding wheat and making bread and releasing the proteins. Bees use the pollen, but through some fermentation process, we think, break down the pollen grains so that the digestive systems of the bees can handle it. So bees must have nectar or honey and pollen as their food source. The colony is the actual physical bees themselves. The hive is the structure that they live in, whether that be in a tree or a man-made hive. It's a similar construction. The colony of bees is made up with a queen bee to head it, and 40 to 60,000 worker bees which support that colony, from baby bees to adult worker bees, a range of ages of bees, and that is then supported by 100 to 1,000 drones perhaps, depending on the opportunity for that colony to raise those drone bees. So the combination of queen, workers, drone make up what we call a swarm. That swarm we put in a box with frames, and we've recreated as near to possible a natural home for honeybees. Bees need to live in a colony. A honeybee on its own cannot survive. At certain ages, certain bees perform certain functions which enables the whole colony to act as a unit. One bee on its own, whether it be the queen, the worker or the drone, can't survive. They can only survive on the support of others. And the honey bees that gather the honey today never live to eat it. They provide that honey as a store for the bees of the future, because a honeybee's life is about 8 weeks. So they are compelled to work and store to provide for the future of the colony all the time. Now, the size of hives we've got here is a 1-box hive. These hives here are 2-box hives. The normal hive in Fiji is 2 boxes. Now, the difference here to, say, a temperate climate country like New Zealand is that a hive in New Zealand would have 4 boxes. But the honey flow in New Zealand will all come in 6 to 8 weeks. So therefore you need a lot of capacity to store the honey over a short time. In the tropics, the honey comes in over 6 months. and the hives never reach the same strength as they do in a temperate climate. Our hives will seldom go above 50,000 bees here. In New Zealand, commonly you'd have hives with 70,000 bees. Now that is to do with the climate and the environment. The urgency for bees to build up strong colonies here is not here because they've got a honey flow available over 6 months of time. The urgency in New Zealand, and even more so in countries like Canada, where you've got a very short window of opportunity for the bees to gather their honey, they build up tremendously strong hives and gather furiously for a short period of time to store enough honey to get them through a long winter period where they're in hibernation. So that is one of the other things that beekeeping in the tropics is quite different. The management is quite different here to what you would have in, say, New Zealand or a temperate climate country.
A queen bee is a fully developed female bee capable of reproduction, capable of laying eggs up to 1,500 to 2,000 a day. And she is the head of the hive. There's only one queen per hive. A good queen is essential to a good hive of bees. And a queen bee, when she mates, will mate with up to 17 different drones before she's sufficiently mated to carry on laying then for the rest of her life. So a queen only mates once in her life in one period, but she will mate with up to 17 drones, and then she can lay 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day probably for the next 2 to 3 years quite successfully, and fertilise those eggs by the stored semen from those drones that she originally mated with.
That is a very good frame of sealed brood. That's a good brood pattern, which tells me the queen is laying very well. And that's mature brood, almost ready to hatch.
A worker bee is a stunted female in the sense that the queen bee and the worker bee both come from the same egg, but the diet fed to the egg and to the subsequent larva is changed and altered to produce a worker bee, which is different to a queen bee. A queen bee is fed on royal jelly for the whole of its life, and a worker bee is fed on royal jelly for a short time, then fed on pollen and honey, which alters its development and equips it to be a worker bee and not a reproducing female. It just becomes a working unit. Within the hive, the worker bee does the cleaning, the guarding, the nursing of all of the young larvae, the grooming and looking after of the queen, the feeding of the queen, dealing with pests and diseases within the hive too. Worker bees deal with that side of it. They do a lot of sanitising by using propolis to sterilise the inside of their hives. And the field work they do is to gather nectar, which eventually they turn to honey, and to gather water, which the hive requires, and to gather pollen, which is their protein source of food.
Now the different ages of bees, that there is a young bee. You can see how grey and fluffy it is. That bee is just hatched. There's another bee there just arriving. It is chewing the top off the cell and fighting to come out. When a young bee hatches, one of its first duties is to go back in and polish out the cell as a housekeeper. And you can see these bees here polishing away, cleaning out the cells, preparing them for the queen to lay the next egg. The next step up, as they gain their strength, and these bees here, little fluffy bees, are all young bees that have just hatched today. Now, as they get older, they then assume different duties. They go from cleaning, then they go to nurse bees, and they will be feeding the young larvae and the young eggs and feeding the brood of the hive. They then progress from there to guards at the entrance of the hive. They then,
After probably 2 to 3 weeks, they become worker bees. They have enough strength, they orientate, they learn where their hive is, and then they become worker bees. So bees, depending on their age, have different functions all the way through. So a hive needs a good mix of young bees and old bees to be fully active. There's another one there that's coming out. There's a new bee being born. And it goes head first straight into a cell. Instinctively starts cleaning.
The drone is the male bee. It also comes from an unfertilized egg laid by the queen. The drone's function is basically for mating. There's no known functions that the drone performs. It doesn't even feed itself. The nurse bees feed the drones and look after them. The drone can only mate once. Mating takes place at 80 feet in the air, and once the drone mates, the drone will fall to the ground and die.